Have you ever come across a situation where a non-Western country imposed sanctions on Western nations? Surprisingly, this has never occurred. Sanctions have historically been a tool used by the West to exert pressure on countries that seek to challenge Western dominance. African nations have also not been immune to these sanctions. Recently, we witnessed the West imposing sanctions on Uganda, Niger, Gabon, and the Central African Republic, removing them from the US-led African Growth and Opportunity Act. These African countries made decisions based on their own judgment, rather than following Western directives, and as expected, the West retaliated with sanctions. This raises the question, why don't African countries impose sanctions on Western nations? With 54 African countries compared to 52 Western countries, the impact of collective African sanctions on the West is worth considering. What if all African nations took a united stance and imposed strong sanctions on the West? This video explores the timeliness and significance of Africa imposing sanctions. In June of this year, the United States implemented visa restrictions on Ugandan officials as a form of sanctions in response to Uganda's adoption of an anti-LGBTQ law. Similarly, the European Union imposed travel restrictions on the military leadership responsible for the coup in Niger. Western powers, particularly the United States and European countries, have repeatedly resorted to such punitive measures to exert influence over African nations. This pattern has become deeply ingrained in Western behavior. If they disagree with a country's policies, regardless of its location, the West unites and imposes sanctions, giving the targeted country two options: reverse its decision or face sanctions. It is important to note that sanctions are more of a blackmailing tool than a legitimate measure in the international arena. However, since Western countries engage in this practice, the international community rarely objects, despite accusations of human rights violations against Western nations in Africa and globally. Surprisingly, there has never been an instance where an African country or organization reciprocated by imposing sanctions on a Western nation. Some argue that African countries might be perceived as too weak to take such actions. However, an alternative perspective suggests that it might be time for African nations to reconsider their restraint. The potential impact of African nations imposing sanctions on the West could have significant consequences for Western powers. Unfortunately, history has shown that African nations have never united against a Western country to make sanctions more effective, and this poses a problem. Nevertheless, the current situation urges Western countries to consider the possibility of facing sanctions from African nations for the first time in history. Sanctions are typically imposed by powerful countries on smaller ones when they believe the smaller country is violating international law. However, in reality, there is no violation of international law. Sanctions are imposed because some countries, despite their weakness and small size, choose not to comply with Western orders. This assertive move is often employed by powerful nations, particularly those with nuclear capabilities, to influence smaller nations and align them with their preferences. While theoretically any country can use sanctions, the historical trend has been one-sided, with the West using sanctions as a tool of control. It is time for African nations to consider their options and the potential consequences of imposing sanctions on the West, which could reshape the dynamics of global power. It is often the case that larger and more powerful nations employ the strategy of sanctions more frequently. The 5 prominent members of the United Nations Security Council, China, France, Great Britain, Russia, and the USA, possess special veto powers and often utilize sanctions to advance their own interests. Unfortunately, this approach does not always consider the desires of smaller and less powerful nations, and the veto power wielded by these 5 countries can hinder global peace. The undemocratic nature of the United Nations Security Council, combined with the use of sanctions, has faced criticism. This situation makes it challenging for regions like Africa, the Middle East, the Far East, and the Caribbean islands to achieve lasting peace. Among these regions, Africa bears the brunt of sanctions, whether imposed by individual countries like the US or France, or international groups like the UN Security Council or the European Union. The commonly cited justification for these sanctions is peace and security. However, it raises the question of how freezing a country's funds or suspending trade deals, actions that adversely impact the nation's economy and the lives of its citizens, genuinely contribute to achieving peace and security. This approach seems counterintuitive, as the measures taken have widespread consequences on the entire population, rather than addressing the root issues that prompted the imposition of sanctions. Let's consider the case of Eritrea in 2009, when the United Nations Security Council alleged Eritrea's support for terrorist groups in Somalia and involvement in a dispute with Djibouti. Sanctions, including the cessation of weapon sales to Eritrea and the cutoff of aid and military training, were imposed on the country. Eritrea endured these severe sanctions for years, only for it to later emerge that there was no evidence supporting the claim of Eritrea's association with terrorist groups. In 2011, the UN Security Council added more sanctions, this time involving financial measures, such as withholding 2% of taxes sent back home by Eritreans living abroad and altering exploration methods in the mining sector. Facing these sanctions, Eritreans worldwide campaigned for their removal, reaching out through letters, emails, and appeals to all 15 members of the Security Council. Despite their efforts, only a few members responded positively. After a decade of grappling with sanctions based on unproven claims, the UN Security Council finally lifted them in 2018. Yes, Eritrea endured 10 years of sanctions for something it didn't even do. That's how punishment is given in international law. Even if those sanctions were lifted, the 10-year period was enough to bring Eritrea's economy to ruins, and that's precisely what the West wanted. It begs the question, why don't we hear the same being done to the United States or France? Why are sanctions not imposed on them mistakenly for a decade? Well, that's because they are the ones who use sanctions as a tool of blackmail. Currently, the West utilizes African organizations to impose sanctions on African nations, which goes against the interests of the continent. Organizations like EISC have become tools of the West, potentially allowing external powers to interfere in African affairs. This interference has resulted in sanctions and even military interventions, as seen during Gaddafi's era in Libya. In response to recent surges and coups since 2019, the African Union and regional economic blocs have implemented sanctions against offending states. This primarily involves suspending their memberships. From June 2019 to August 2023, the AU suspended the memberships of Sudan, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, and most recently Gabon. Similar measures were taken by regional blocs in West and Central Africa against Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Gabon. In 67% of recent coups, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, imposed economic sanctions against offending states. This is clear evidence that, in most cases, Western nations punish African countries by using African organizations as tools. However, the good news is that in the current wave of coups, there is a notable pattern where sanctions did not prevent repeated overthrows in Sudan, Mali, and Burkina Faso. The sanctions imposed on these countries proved ineffective in preventing recurring coups. Nevertheless, we are now witnessing African organizations resisting pressure from Western countries. While Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea faced prompt suspension, the AU hesitated to act against Niger and Chad. The AU acted independently, refraining from treating the situation as an unconstitutional change of government and citing security risks. Currently, EES has become the West's favorite ally, issuing economic and administrative sanctions against all coup countries in its region. However, the effectiveness of these sanctions was diminished by neighboring countries' actions. In Mali, Some states expressed reservations about the sanctions and enhanced cooperation with the country's authorities. Critics argue that African organizations unintentionally facilitate external interference by imposing sanctions and allowing military interventions. This raises doubts about their effectiveness in safeguarding the continent's interests. The narrative advocates for a re-evaluation of the role of African organizations, emphasizing the need to assess their effectiveness in advancing peace and stability. The actions of the African Union and regional blocs like ECOWAS contribute to the susceptibility of African nations to external interference. If these organizations effectively fulfilled their roles, the European Union and European countries would not have grounds to interfere in African affairs whenever they please. It is astonishing that despite the negative consequences of Western interference, the African Union and ECOWAS still seek approval and aid from the West during crises in Africa. The devastating impacts of such interventions are evident in the case of Libya. These observations suggest that the African Union and ECOWAS might be acting as tools serving Western interests, deploying sanctions as a weapon instead of direct military action against nations that stand their ground. African leaders with Western support often evade sanctions, even amid allegations of corruption and suffering. However, when leaders resist certain agendas, they face sanctions on various grounds. Overall, there is a call for Africa to reassess its relationship with the West and assert its independence. The legitimacy of African organizations is scrutinized if they persist in serving as tools and pawns for Western interests. Africa needs to stand resolute against external pressures and adopt a more self-determined approach to governance and development, having endured Western interference for an extended period. Africa is being urged to change its approach and take actions to reverse the current dynamic. This proposed strategy includes various measures such as sanctioning former colonial powers for their past actions, imposing reciprocal sanctions on countries that unjustly sanction Africa, holding accountable those responsible for assassinations of African leaders through sanctions, and imposing sanctions on nations contributing to destabilization in African countries. Additionally, Africa should respond to the exploitation of its minerals by the West by imposing sanctions. These suggested measures go beyond economic actions and advocate for a complete shift in diplomatic relations. Africa is encouraged to explore alternative partnerships with countries like Russia, China, and other Asian nations, reducing its dependence on the West. Proposals include reciprocating travel bans, expelling companies involved in exploiting African resources, and causing environmental pollution. The overarching goal is for Africa to become more self-reliant and independent, reducing its dependence on the West. The vision is to achieve an industrialized Africa, free from external exploitation and interference. This transformation requires a courageous reassessment of Africa's relationship with the West, emphasizing self-determination and resilience. There is also a call for the dismantling of Western military bases, especially those utilized by the US and France for surveillance in Africa, aiming to alter the continent's security dynamics. However, it is worth noting that the sanctions imposed by the West on Africa have had some unexpected positive outcomes. The West believed that sanctioning Africa would keep it under their influence, but the situation has changed. The looming threat of new US sanctions against African nations appears to divert them from America's influence and push them towards a new world order orchestrated by the East. When historians analyze the conflict between the West and Russia, a crucial aspect will likely be the misguided beliefs held by leaders such as Joe Biden. They remain steadfast in their conviction that the Ukrainian army, with their support, could swiftly overcome the Russians, underestimating the complexities of the situation. Additionally, these Western leaders overestimated the influence they believed their former colonial outposts in Africa held, expecting compliance with London and Washington's sanctions and perceived hegemony. Historians might characterize these misguided beliefs as delusional. This delusional thinking not only poses economic challenges for Western countries, such as post-war years with food rationing and soaring prices in the UK, but it also paves the way for a new world order and a transformative reset. This transformation begins with sanctions. While historical evidence suggests that sanctions often fall short of achieving their objectives, the effectiveness of more potent secondary sanctions remains uncertain. These sanctions target allies, restricting their trade with a shared adversary. Recent warnings from the Biden administration, directed at African nations considering purchasing oil from Russia, might have escaped mainstream media's notice. However, if implemented, these threats could represent a monumental historical error, potentially signaling the end of US hegemony as it is currently understood. Recently, Russia facilitated the departure of grain ships from the port of Odessa, mitigating a crisis faced by numerous African and Middle Eastern countries on the verge of a food shortage. The implications of a nation in these regions being unable to produce and sell subsidized bread cannot be underestimated. Such conditions have historically led to revolutions, increased support for terrorist groups, and a surge in individuals fleeing to join migrant caravans heading for Europe. Credit is due to Putin for promptly endorsing the deal in response to lobbying efforts from various countries urging him to act. Considering the broader picture, Europe, in particular, expresses gratitude to Putin and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for preventing a potential food crisis resulting from wheat shortages in the region. The absence of any sense of gratitude or goodwill has undermined the prospects of advancing these talks to the next level. During her visit to Accra, Ghana, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, delivered a clear threat to any African country considering the purchase of Russian oil. It seems that the collective actions of America and the West have overplayed their hand. The repercussions of this miscalculation by Biden, a recurring theme, will ultimately affect the West itself. African countries may find ways to dissolve these sanctions. It is important to note that the secondary sanctions imposed by the Trump administration against China, India, and a few others to prevent them from buying Iranian oil were not enforced by Biden. Enforcing these sanctions may prove to be challenging. Furthermore, African governments, willing to stand up to Washington's delusional and outdated bullying, may impose blockades on precious metals and minerals crucial for Western-manufactured devices like iPhones. In such a scenario, these governments may choose to sell these resources exclusively to the East, which could provide them with substantial geopolitical advantages. However, the long-term threat resulting from Biden's recent misstep lies in the potential alignment of African countries with a new world order shaped by the East. During a crucial UN vote in February, 20 African countries refused to condemn Russia's incursion into Ukraine and expressed their desire to remain non-aligned. They wish to avoid a conflict they see as not their own and maintain trading options with both camps in the future. As China, Russia, and India strengthen their trade and military ties, the East is gaining dominance. Consequently, the threats of new US sanctions could prompt some African countries to step out of their non-aligned comfort zone and align themselves with this emerging world order. China, already the largest investor in Africa, makes this transition plausible. Recent events, such as the withdrawal of French troops from Mali, to be replaced by Russian mercenaries, and the donation of new aircraft by Putin, indicate the evolving dynamics in the region. Additionally, several Middle Eastern countries have shown interest in joining BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, as they can anticipate the changing global landscape. President Joe Biden has also announced plans to exclude Uganda, Gabon, Niger, and the Central African Republic from the special US-Africa trade program. These nations, accused of gross human rights violations or lacking progress in democratic governance, will be removed from the African Growth and Opportunity Act established in 2000. It is vital to understand that this act grants duty-free access to the US for over 1,000 800 products from eligible sub-Saharan African countries. President Biden cited insufficient progress in establishing political pluralism and the rule of law as the reasons for the exclusion of Niger and Gabon, which are currently under military rule due to recent coups. This decision follows Uganda's removal from the African Growth and Opportunity Act after passing a controversial anti-homosexuality law that includes a death penalty for certain same-sex acts. President Biden's decision may escalate tensions and prompt African nations to explore ways to counter these sanctions. The implications of this move, combined with potential conflicts over oil purchases, underscore the risk of a significant miscalculation with consequences for both the US and the affected nations. These broader repercussions extend to the geopolitical landscape, with the possibility of alliances shifting as African countries consider aligning with the new world order shaped by the East. China's significant investments in Africa make such a transition plausible, while recent events, like the withdrawal of French troops from Mali, demonstrate the evolving dynamics in the region. President Biden's decision could have long-term implications for the alignment of African nations in a potential new Cold War scenario. Instead of taking sides, non-aligned countries prefer to keep their trading options open. However, this move may inadvertently contribute to the growing influence of the East, specifically China, Russia, and India, as they strengthen their trade and military ties with African nations. During this time, African nations should consider uniting and imposing sanctions on the West in return. Historically, Western countries, particularly former colonial powers, have exerted disproportionate influence over African nations. By imposing reciprocal sanctions, African nations can level the power dynamics, assert their independence, and challenge unjust treatment by Western nations. The threat of reciprocal sanctions acts as a deterrent to discourage Western countries from imposing unfair sanctions, aiming to facilitate negotiation, dialogue, and a more equitable resolution of disputes. Advocates emphasize the call for African unity in imposing sanctions, fostering solidarity among nations to bolster Africa's global bargaining power. They argue that a united front would enable the continent to assert its interests more effectively. Advocates also argue that imposing sanctions on Western countries would draw attention to perceived double standards in global politics, challenging the narrative that only powerful nations have the right to use sanctions as a foreign policy tool. In a hypothetical scenario where 54 African nations collectively impose sanctions on 50 European states, the US, and Canada in response to sanctions against African nations, a comprehensive assessment of the potential economic impact on both sides would be necessary before implementing reciprocal sanctions. African nations would need to understand the consequences for their economies and the targeted Western nations. Gaining support from regions and countries outside Africa would be crucial, and alliances with nations sharing similar concerns about perceived unfair sanctions and global power imbalances would likely be sought. Given that China and Russia are aligned with Africa, imposing sanctions on the West can yield more effective results. African nations would need to enhance their economic resilience to withstand potential repercussions from targeted Western sanctions. Developing robust economic strategies and diversifying trade partners, as they have already done by aligning with China and Russia, would be important. In the context of economic responses, African nations possess a range of tools to wield against the West. One such strategy is trade retaliation, which involves targeted restrictions on specific sectors or goods crucial to Western industries. This could include measures like limiting the export of cobalt essential for Western battery production or curbing diamond sales that drive luxury markets. The effectiveness of this strategy would depend on careful planning, evaluation of potential consequences, and solidarity among African nations. Tensions rise when African nations have control over strategic resources. Another approach is to exert financial pressure, such as freezing diplomatic assets or withdrawing funds from Western banks, to create financial turbulence and send a strong message. Travel restrictions, like limiting visas or imposing travel bans on Western officials and business leaders, can disrupt diplomatic channels and impact interconnected economies. In addition to economic strategies, African nations can explore alternative approaches by leveraging their collective voice and utilizing platforms like the African Union. Condemning Western sanctions collectively has the potential to gain global support and exert diplomatic pressure. This may involve impactful addresses that highlight the negative effects of sanctions on African development and advocate for fairer trade practices. The question arises: should African countries unite and impose the harshest sanctions on the West as a form of punishment? It's important to consider the potential consequences if the entire continent of Africa decides to take a stand, alienate the West, and align with China and Russia. We invite you to share your thoughts on whether African nations have the power to punish the West and whether they are united in doing so.